Good evening, everyone. I know that we have over 170 people attending the event this evening. Thank you so much for your support. I wish I could see you all directly, but thank you very much for being with us this evening. For those of you who don't know who I am Helen Jeys, the headmistress of Manchester High School for Girls, and I'm very excited to be hosting this event in conversation with the archivists. Throughout the evening, I will be monitoring the Q&A function so that I can ask questions as we progress through the evening. So please do ask any questions that you have on the Q&A function. We will try and get to as many of those questions as we can. So let me introduce the archivists to you. Gwen Hobson and Pam Roberts have worked at Manchester High since the 1980s. Gwen started as head of German in 1984 and Pam as head of French in 1988. They shared the running of the Modern Languages department for many years. They also took on new areas of responsibility. Gwen as head of year 10 or 11, and Pam as Oxbridge coordinator and professional mentor for initial teacher training. In 2008, they became assistant heads. Pam became director of sixth form and Gwen was director of co-curriculum. In this role, she was responsible for organising major school events such as Speech Day and Founders Day, and used the archive extensively to prepare films and presentations on aspects of the school's history. Gwen and Pam both retired as assistant heads in December 2014, but in March 2017, when the school archivist, Dr. Christine Joy, retired, they were asked to take over as part-time archivists, as they had been at the school for so long and knew it so well.
Yeah, it has to be said that we didn't envisage embarking on a new career in our 60s, but we are absolutely delighted to be back at Manchester High and thrilled to be back in contact with the old girls and our colleagues. And we never imagined that working in the archive would be so interesting, and we've learned so much. And so we're really excited to be able to share the history of Manchester High with everyone. It is a remarkable school.
But before we go any further, we have to acknowledge three key people who were instrumental in setting up the archive. David Abbott, the former bursar, who, Indiana Jones-like, rescued the archive from the damp cellar. Rita Russell, the former librarian, who whetted our appetite for stories from the archive. And above all, Dr. Christine Joy, who many of you will remember was head of history for many years before devoting herself full-time to the archive in 2001. And it's thanks to her scholarship that we have, well, a forensically catalogued collection and detailed notes on the school's history. Yeah. The archive wouldn't be what it is today without her superhuman efforts.
Yes, absolutely.
Amazing. Brilliant, thank you. It's going to be a really interesting evening. We've got so many questions that have already been sent to us in advance. So why don't we start with an obvious first question? Could you tell us why the archive is so important?
Well, it's been described by one historian as one of the most important collections of girls' schools records in the country. So it's of national and international importance. And it's also important for the Manchester community because it documents local history, the stories of prominent Manchester citizens, the fight for women's suffrage, life during the wars.
And we often exchange information with other local historians and archives, for example, the Manchester Museum, the Museum of Science and Industry, the Rusholme Archive. And we've also been involved in a recent project, which is very interesting, with the Jewish community. It's a project called We Were There Too, and it documents the contribution made by Jews and other ethnic and religious groups to the First World War effort.
And why else is it important? Well, we know that Manchester High opened for the first time on January the 19th, 1874, it was one of the first few academic girls' schools in the country and the very first in the north. And we're very lucky that we have in the archive records which tell the story of the school from the planning and foundation stages right through to the present day.
So we have 147 years worth of documents which track the story of girls' education through significant periods of history. And the archive is a very important collection, and it's consulted by academics and researchers from all over this country and also from abroad. So recently we've had contact with Canada, Australia, Spain, France, the Netherlands and New Zealand.
And we've helped a final year undergraduate from Oxford who won the History Faculty Prize for her dissertation on Manchester High School magazines from 1883 to 1914. And at the moment, we're working with a PhD student in history at Sciences Po, which is the Paris Institute of Political Studies, and it's one of the elite French grandes écoles.
The archive is registered with the National Archive and with the Schools Archive and Records Association. And in 2003, Dr. Joy applied for Heritage Lottery funding, and the archive was awarded a really substantial grant under this scheme in recognition of its importance.
Yeah, so yes, it is an important archive.
Gosh, it's amazing. But what's actually in it then?
Well, we have governor's minutes going right back to the planning stage of the foundation. And the early ones are, of course, handwritten. Some of them are in the most beautiful copperplate. They are a work of art. And they record all the important decisions made about premises, about the appointment of staff, about the curriculum.
And we've also got the school reports from 1873 onwards until they ceased publication in the early 1960s. And these are a combination of prospectus and detailed annual inspection reports, because the founders wanted to ensure the highest quality of education for the girls.
And they contain staff lists and class lists, which are very useful for researchers, people doing family research, for example.
The report for 1873 contains the original list of subscribers, because what's really important and significant about the foundation of Manchester High is that it wasn't founded by an individual or by a religious institution, but by Mancunians themselves. An organisation called the Manchester Association for the Promotion of the Education of Women, we wish it was shorter, launched a public appeal in 1873 to found a girls' school of the highest type.
And so within a few weeks, over 140 Mancunians had contributed sums of money ranging from as little as £1 to £150. So in effect, it was an early form of crowdfunding.
We also have a huge collection of photographs. The earliest is a staff photograph taken in 1878. We have to be careful how we use the photos. GDPR, unfortunately, restricts our ability to share photos where people may still be alive and can easily be recognised. But we do have plenty of form photographs, team photos, and what are known in the trade as curly-whirlies, the long panoramic whole school photos.
We also have school magazines from the very beginning, and the early ones give a lot of information about the life of the school. So there are reports from all the school societies, there's a chronicle of the year, huge amounts of really impressive creative writing, and news of old girls as well.
Because what we have to remember is that in the early days, going to university was not the norm. So first year undergraduates wrote articles for the school magazines to report back on their experience of university life and to encourage others to follow in their footsteps. And they make absolutely fascinating reading.
One of our favourite things is the boarding house chronicle. You might not know that Manchester High had boarding houses for a very brief period from 1899 to the 1920s. And it's an album, it's a handwritten record of life in the boarding house in Victoria Park by two girls, Muriel Bedson and Constance Gill. And they describe their pranks and their punishments. And that too has been the subject of recent academic research. It's wonderful.
We have mountains of newspaper articles and miscellaneous items relating to the school, including school reports donated by generations of old girls.
I school girls reports,
academic reports.
Yeah.
And they make absolutely fascinating reading because they reflect educational priorities and attitudes of their day. The early ones can be remarkably,
well, actually they're painfully frank. Nowadays reports are much more constructive.
And we reckon there must be a PhD in there for someone working their way through 147 years of those.
And I mean, the last thing we should say is that we're very lucky that old girls have been very generous in donating items and personal recollections for the archive. So one old girl recently let us scan her complete collection of internal and external exam papers. And again, these give a good insight into the academic standards of the day. And we also have exercise books and textbooks. And we've just received a donation of a late member of staff's teaching notes as well. So more than we can mention tonight, huge amounts of things.
And considering that, it sounds as if you've got enough to fill the entire school physically.
Oh, yeah, we do.
So where is it? Where is it in school?
Oh, well, we have visited some school archives where the archivists have their own museums and they have those rolling stacks. And we really covet those, Helen. So one of these days, we aren't quite as lucky. We do have a few cupboards. We have two very large internal, well, not very large, large-ish internal store cupboards. We have a bookcase in the library and a few rickety old wardrobes in the green room behind the stage.
Teaching and learning has to come first.
We understand.
And we understand that. And we cope with the room that we have available.
Yeah.
And it might not be ideal, but it's secure.
Yeah.
And the Heritage Lottery funding enabled Dr. Joy to get many of the fragile documents professionally rebound. They were rebound by the John Rylands Library. And to purchase archive quality CCOL albums for the photographs. And the storerooms are internal, so there's no danger of damage by sunlight, and the temperature and humidity are relatively constant.
Yeah, that's right. And we recently attended a Zoom course on conservation.
We take it seriously.
We do, and we learned quite a lot about pests, the ones that like to munch their way through paper and fabric. And we are very proud to say that now we know the difference between mouse droppings and bat droppings. Because apparently it has been a problem for some archives that have been closed during lockdown. So we're delighted to report that we have no signs of infestation so far.
That's reassuring, really, really reassuring. So apart from all those governor records, do you have anything really valuable in the archive?
Well, we don't have anything in the same league of some of the great boys' public schools, but we do have some interesting artifacts.
Yes, you will have walked past or driven past one of them very many times. And we're talking about the white sculpture in 3 parts above the old main front door on Grangethorpe Road. And it was presented to school by the Chair of Governors, Dorothy Pilkington, to commemorate the courageous leadership of the headmistress, Dr. Clark, and her staff after the school was bombed in 1940.
It's called Threshold, and it was sculpted by Mitzi Cunliffe. She is more widely known as the designer of the BAFTA mask. Her daughters were at Manchester High at the time, and the school now is part of the Mitzi Cunliffe Trail through Manchester, as her work is attracting a lot of interest again and is being promoted by the 20th Century Society. It has to be said, most of her work is
outside on buildings. There's a huge installation on the water pumping station in Heaton Park, for example. So yeah, so that's interesting. And we also have the two Pankhurst maquettes, the models for statues. In 2002, the school bought two maquettes of Sylvia Pankhurst, who was a pupil from 1893 to 1898, and they were sculpted by Ian Walters. And one is in downstairs reception, and the other is in Helen's study. So they were models for a proposed statue of Sylvia Pankhurst, and it was intended to go up outside the Houses of Parliament. In the end, it was Millicent Fawcett's whose statue that went up. But I think there are plans, aren't there?
Yeah. And we also have a letter and a reference signed by Ernest Rutherford in 1990.
There's a
for,
great physicist.
For Miss Annie Ellis. She was a former pupil of Manchester High and later became a member of the teaching staff. She taught here from 1917 to 1959.
Yeah, a long time.
She studied mathematics at Girton, then returned to Manchester to do a BSc in physics, and was a research student with Ernest Rutherford at Manchester University and worked as an assistant lecturer with him, as well as working at the high school. And I mean, the physics department was super excited when we showed them the letter signed by the great man himself. And I think some old girls will remember Annie Ellis.
Yes.
Apparently she was an inspirational teacher, but also tiny. She was barely 5 feet tall, I think.
Yeah. Wow. But really, the records are beyond price because of the stories they tell about the remarkable achievements of the girls and the staff over the decades, and the insights they give about changes in society and attitudes to education for girls and opportunities for women in the professions as well. So, you know, it's the monetary value is really incidental, I think.
Yeah, so they're priceless, aren't they?
They are priceless, yes.
So on a kind of day-to-day basis, what actually is your role as archivists?
Well, we have huge numbers of enquiries from academics. We couldn't possibly list them all tonight, but we can give you an idea. We've had an inquiry from Manchester Museum about Dr. Clark, who visited China, and they wanted information for a future exhibition. There was flute playing in girls' schools in the early 1800s and early 1900s, because it was rare in those days. We had gardening in girls' schools between 1870 and 1939. Health and exercise, sport comes up a lot. Health and exercise for middle-class girls in secondary schools between 1870 and 1914. So those are just some.
Yeah, so we have, and we've also, in addition to the academic inquiries, some of which take quite a long time as students work through their dissertations, we get some unexpected ones. So we were astonished, I think is the only word to describe it, to be contacted by a sea shanty group in Dorset who wanted information about Cicely Fox Smith, who's an old girl, and she's a poet and a celebrated author of sea shanties, although she was born and brought up in Lymm and educated in Manchester.
Yeah, so that was a good one. And we also receive lots of inquiries from people researching their family history, and that's from all over the world. Obviously, we can only give information about people whom we know to be dead, but we, you know, it's lovely to be able to help them, and families are really touched when they see old admissions forms with signatures on and addresses, and it's really quite heartwarming, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, one lady in New Zealand, she had never seen her grandfather's signature. It was on her mother's admissions form that she saw that, and she was very thrilled.
She was really thrilled.
Wow, I mean, you've mentioned how priceless these records are and what they tell us about the school's history, and you've mentioned a little bit about this already, but from your point of view, with what we have in the archive, what is so remarkable about MHSG's history?
Well, it's a pioneering girls' school, and its pupils have been pioneers in all sorts of fields. And it seems incomprehensible to us now, but we have to remember that there was no academic girls' school in Manchester in the 1870s, and very few in the country as a whole. And we follow on from great schools, from North London Collegiate, founded by Frances Buss, and Cheltenham Ladies College, founded by Dorothea Beale. And those are the two great names in girls' education. And the founders actually sought their advice. And we have letters dating back to 1873 from Miss Beale in the archive.
So Manchester High was founded as a result of the work of the Manchester Association for the Promotion of the Education of Women, because in the 19th century, there was still widespread suspicion of female education. Girls were often regarded as intellectually inferior to boys. There were fears that the education of girls would damage their health,
or make them infertile, even.
Would undermine social norms, or be an unnecessary burden on parents and the taxpayer.
Yeah. And so despite all those prejudices, the Manchester Association launched their public appeal to found a girls' school of the highest type. And the founders described the aims of the school as being to impart to the scholars the very best education which can be given, and to fit them for any future which may be before them. And they wanted to provide for Manchester's daughters what had been provided without stint for Manchester's sons, and that has gone on. They're still doing it today.
The first thing they needed to do was to find a headmistress. But it was very difficult to find a suitable candidate because, think about it, chicken and egg, so few women had the necessary academic qualifications or experience. But they were determined to attract the best. So they offered what's described as a very liberal salary of £200 a year, plus a capitation fee of 10 shillings, which we're old enough to be able to interpret as 50p, for each pupil over the number of 60. And then it's difficult to give an exact equivalent in today's money, but it's likely to be about £100,000.
Yes.
Wow.
So, you know.
Yeah. The first headmistress was Elizabeth Day, and what is amazing is that she was only 29 when she was appointed. She'd been a governess since she was 15, and she'd been a student and a pupil teacher at Queen's College in London for the previous 6 years. Queen's was founded in 1848, and it did offer some academic qualifications. And so she was a Londoner. She was initially very reluctant to apply for the post of headmistress in Manchester, because even then we had the north-south divide.
She simply didn't relish the prospect of living in a northern industrial town, which by the standards of London and the south was an educational wilderness. And she was also wary of latent male prejudices about women in education. And she explained to the founders that she had previously applied for a post as headmistress and had been told that she was too young and would probably marry, and my husband would turn out to be a scamp and get at the funds through me.
But she was assured that nothing of the sort would be said to her. And so she came up to Manchester in July 1873 for her interview, and she stayed overnight with Harriet and Robert Derbyshire, who were members of the committee, and they lived in Victoria Park, which was then a highly desirable, very leafy suburb of Manchester. And according to the school magazine of 1899, she was very surprised to see that there were trees in Manchester and that she could hear birds singing in the Derbyshire's garden. Unfortunately for us, she overcame her prejudices and she accepted the post.
So the next major consideration was premises. So 2 large houses, 369 and 371, Portland Terrace, Oxford Road, were rented. The location was highly suitable and very cleverly chosen, because nearby were Owens College, Manchester College of Music, and the residential areas, which, as Pam has mentioned, were very much favoured by Manchester's professional classes. And Oxford Road was the main artery into town. So the school would easily be seen by people travelling into and out of the city.
You may not know that the Portland Terrace houses stood on the site of the present University Stopford building, i.e. the medical school, and Sir John Stopford was one of our governors later.
So the target date for opening was the 19th of January 1874. The two houses had been fitted out to accommodate 180 girls, but by the end of December 1873, only 20 girls had been enrolled.
Yes, some Manchester citizens clearly were not at all impressed. And so Elizabeth Day and members of the committee had actually to go out and tout for business by knocking on doors and handing out prospectuses. So there was still opposition to be overcome. And even then, marketing was important.
And the founders were clearly very nervous, but they needn't have worried. When Manchester High opened for the first time on the 19th of January, 60 girls enrolled. And everyone loves the story of the hansom cab, which had to be ordered to take the heavy weight of gold brought in as fees to the Union Bank on Oxford Street. And the fees were?
The fees were 4 guineas, i.e. £4, 4 shillings for girls under 14, and 5 guineas for girls over 14. And within 18 months of the opening, the 2 houses were full. So a third house was rented, and within a year that was full, and applicants for places had to be turned away. So the governors decided to build a new school, and they chose the site in nearby Dover Street, which was then a quiet side road off Oxford Road.
And the governors wanted a school which was the most modern of its time. So in 1879, they commissioned Mills and Murgatroyd. They are the architects who designed the Royal Exchange building in Manchester. And they wanted the best.
Yes, they wanted a school which was the most modern of its time. And it was purpose built. So the facilities were remarkable. So we had science laboratories, we had a gymnasium, a library, we had a cookery room and art rooms, a hall, a playground. And we have some wonderful photos in the archive of the interiors and the exterior of Dover Street.
So Grangethorpe, where we are now, is the school's third home. Because by the 1930s, Dover Street too was becoming too small and the school needed more space. And Manchester High moved here in September 1940.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more then about the school during the war years? Because you've heard a lot about that in recent founders events. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, if we talk first about World War I, the headmistress, Sara Burstall, was on holiday when war was declared on the 4th of August, 1914, and she immediately returned to Manchester, and she took advice from the Red Cross and organised a small centre for making clothes and hospital supplies at Manchester High. And the staff and girls collected the materials and money. And so the school magazine of December 1914 reports on the need for bandages and splints, and the fact that a very enthusiastic band of girls was organised to begin work within a few days of the declaration of war. They worked from 10 in the morning till 1 o'clock in the afternoon, making bandages, and they were sent out to the Red Cross centres in Urmston and Victoria Park.
And the school magazine also reports that jam making was one of the most important aspects of relief work. And by December 1914, they had produced 2,400 pounds of jam, much in demand, and it was sent again to Urmston,
yes,
and to Red Cross centres.
And we have photos of this, and we also have photos of girls growing potatoes as part of the war effort. And what was really touching was that the girls themselves requested that school prizes should be suspended for the duration, and they received a certificate instead of a prize, and the money was donated.
Yeah, and we've recently received a donation of one of these certificates, beautifully preserved, for the archives. We're proud of that. There are lots of stories to tell of the contributions made by individual girls and staff to the war effort. And we have an exhibition about this, and we will let you know how you can access more information about Manchester High during World War I.
Yeah.
World War II presented the school with a fresh set of challenges.
Yeah.
The start of the war, the school was still located in Dover Street, which was quite close to key manufacturing installations. And so the school was evacuated in 1939 to a safe place in the country.
Which turned out to be Chinglehune. They went off by train to Chinglehune. But meanwhile, in 1940, planning was still going on for the move between Dover Street and the new school in Grangethorpe Road. So Dr. Clark was able to move the school back to Grangethorpe on the 18th of September, 1940. However, only a few months later, on the night of the 22nd to the 23rd of December, the school was hit by a landmine and it was almost completely destroyed. Fortunately, the Christmas holidays had already begun, so no one was hurt.
But we have a fascinating account written by a member of staff who describes the head, Dr. Clark, recalling the staff during the holiday to crunch through the rubble and to rescue as much as possible in terms of books, furniture and equipment. So we guess that health and safety and risk assessments haven't quite been invented then.
And it's hard to believe that they managed during the holidays to find alternative accommodation in Didsbury so that term could start on the correct day in January, and not a single day's teaching was lost, as they say.
The school was accommodated in 3 buildings: Worley, Broomfield and Central Road. And some of the people listening tonight may well have been there. And if so, we would love to have your reminiscences.
Yeah.
We were thrilled to receive a photograph recently of the Broomfield gatepost, Broomfield written on it, which had been rescued from a skip by the father of a former pupil, and she now has it in her garden.
It's a measure of the affection old girls have for the school that they have the gatepost. And given the circumstances, it's understandable that the archive doesn't have so much detailed information or records from those years. So if old girls can help us in any way, we would be really grateful. Senior school girls didn't come back to Grangethorpe until 1949. And you might be surprised to know that the prep didn't return here until 1973.
Gosh.
So, yeah, quite late.
We've got some very excited people in the chat going, I was at Broomfield. So good. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of feedback on that one, which is great. Another obvious question, but a question that a lot of us are really interested in. Can you tell us about the school's connection with the Pankhurst sisters?
Yeah, okay. So Emmeline Pankhurst's daughters, Christabel, Sylvia and Adela, were pupils at Manchester High between 1893 and 1902. Christabel was a pupil from 1893 to 1897, and we even have an examiner's report from 1894, which states that she gave ready and thoughtful answers in the history oral exam. And she was the first woman to study law at Manchester and the first woman to graduate, and with a first, no less. But as a woman, she wasn't allowed to practice as a barrister. She did apply, but she wasn't allowed.
Sylvia, her sister, was a pupil from Manchester High from 1893 to 1898. And then she went on to study art at the Manchester School of Art. And Adela, the youngest, was a pupil at Manchester High between 1893 and 1902. She was a prolific writer, and she contributed many stories to the school magazine and was appointed sub-editor in 1901.
Yeah, we still have Adela's stories in the archive. But yes, we all know how important the contribution of the Pankhurst was to the campaign for women's suffrage. But what is not quite so well known is that other staff and girls were involved either as suffragettes or as suffragists who were less militant. And the story we love is the story of Sara Burstall's dilemma. She was the second headmistress, and she was a strong supporter of the suffrage movement. But yeah, as headmistress, she realised that the head of an endowed public school couldn't, in honour, set an example of breaking the law. So she was tempted to join the campaign to withhold income tax on the basis of no taxation without representation. But she knew that it would be inappropriate for a woman in her position.
And so in her book, Retrospect and Prospect, she explained that personally I had been born a suffragist, for my parents both believed in votes for women, but I had never felt able to do anything of a public character. She felt strongly she couldn't do anything that would endanger the public perception of the value of educating girls, when the whole idea really was still in its infancy.
Yeah. Nevertheless, they did fight on, and in 1908, the Head Mistresses Conference was held at Manchester High, and there was a resolution for women's suffrage that was carried by a large majority. They said that they desire to place on record their strong conviction that the grant of the parliamentary franchise to women was both just and expedient.
But she wrote later, it's difficult today for women to realise what a bold step this was.
And later, in July 1913, Sara Burstall and some of her staff, all wearing their academic gowns, took part in the Manchester to Stockport leg of the nationwide suffrage pilgrimage, which converged on London from all parts of the country to show their support for votes for women.
And Miss Burstall felt that it would be correct for her to go on a pilgrimage at this point, especially as her age entitled her to a seat on the lorry. And she recalled, crowds watched us, sometimes with hootings, but as we came into Stockport, there were showers of stones, fortunately small, from a crowd of women. No one took any harm, but the incident is perhaps worth recording.
And there was an old girl, Constance Grant, who was also part of the march, and she describes some of the women onlookers shouting to her that she wanted a bloke, not a vote. So I think we can be quite proud. We can be quite proud of our contribution to the campaign for votes.
Absolutely. Gosh. We've had lots of questions that have come in, and it's lovely to see some names that are recognised too. So just a few from the Q&A part of for this evening. Molly asks, what's your personal favourite item in the archive? What's your favourite item?
Favourite item? Ooh, that's a difficult one.
I think this set, for me, it's the set of glass lantern slides taken in 1905. Sara Burstall was about to go on a lecture tour of Canada, and she had all aspects of life at Dover Street in 1905 photographed and put onto glass lantern slides. They're sort of about this size. And we have just had them professionally digitized. And they are magnificent. They are so crisp. And now that they've been professionally digitized, you can zoom in and it's just wonderful details.
Marvelous, absolutely marvelous. And what's even better is the fact that they were rescued from a member of staff's garage. So we might not even have
you,
had them.
in fact.
I think you brought them, Helen. You brought them over.
Yeah, I think they were in Stuart Leaming's garage. I think there's a note in the box.
Yes.
I think you might need these. So.
Thank you for bringing them back to us.
Gosh, who thought it? And Kate asks, and actually this relates to something that I know you'll be releasing soon. What about the ivy leaf emblem? Where did that come from?
Oh, right. Well, yes,
without anticipating.
We don't anticipate too much because we just made a film about it.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert, yes. Basically, it was a marketing ploy. It was branding. Because after the first few years, Manchester High had competition. So they needed a logo. They needed something to
sort of identify it in school. I mean, you have to understand, we have to remember that when it first opened, girls didn't wear uniform.
Yeah.
And also there were no other schools, so they didn't really need to kind of identify themselves or set themselves apart.
Yeah, but as more schools followed on from us, we were a model for other schools in the area. We had competition. And so basically we had to establish our corporate identity. Those terms would not be used then, but that's what it was. And it was first it was first seen on the sports kit. The hockey team wore it. First of all, the ivy, and it was the girls were asked to make suggestions for an emblem, and the ivy leaf was chosen.
But
we won't say too much more.
Watch the film.
Watch the film. Yes.
Gosh, as simple as that, though. We've also had a question about how the demographics of pupils have changed over the decades.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah.
The first cohort of pupils ranged in age from 7 to 18, and they were overwhelmingly middle class.
Yes.
They were the daughters of merchants, manufacturers, doctors, clergymen, a daughter of a journalist, a pawnbroker, a warehouseman.
Yeah.
But we're talking fathers here.
Yes, it's fathers, because mothers' occupations weren't mentioned. They wouldn't have worked, and even in the case of the Pankhurst girls, it's their father, Richard Pankhurst, who signed the admissions forms, and people are always very disappointed that we haven't got Emmeline's signature. But, you know, in those days, no, it was the fathers who counted.
And in terms of the catchment area, things actually haven't really changed that much. Even in 1874, pupils were coming in from as far away as Altrincham, Hyde, and the majority were clustered around school because it was a very fashionable area.
Yeah.
But by 1914, we'd expanded, taking pupils in from Rochdale, Bury, Macclesfield, even Buxton.
Yeah.
By 1954, Warrington, Stalybridge, Knutsford. The situation is pretty much the same today. It's probably just the density of where those pupil pockets are located that will have changed.
I mean, it was the site was well chosen because transport was easy. People could get in from a distance, as they can now.
Absolutely. And obviously this raises or brings in the important question about diversity at Manchester High, which is so important to us now because the diversity of our student body is a huge strength of the school. So I wonder if you can tell us whether, from the perspective of the archive, the diversity of pupils has always been important in terms of the foundation of the school too?
I think
yes,
absolutely.
Yes, I mean, the first thing we have to say is, well, first of all, in 1874, the founders were writing an enormous, incomprehensible now injustice in making it possible for girls to be educated in the same way as their brothers, and it's too easy to forget that. But the second point is that from the very beginning, the founders' aim was to make education for girls available to any girls of suitable age, character and ability, without any distinction as to religious profession or social rank.
Because I think in 1874, diversity really came down to religious profession and social rank. But I think we can be really proud of the fact that this guiding principle has evolved over the decades to take account of changes in society. So
in the early 1900s, for example, we had several Armenian pupils who had been refugees from Turkey.
During the First World War, Manchester High took in a number of Belgian refugees, girls and teachers, and we can see from their admissions forms that they were offered free places.
And then at the beginning of the Second World War, the school took in a number of Jewish refugees, at least one on kinder transport, and again, sometimes with reduced fees, and also some boys, because in those days, during the war, we took in some boys in prep, and we have done at other points in the school's history.
So, I mean, we would agree. Now, I mean, one of the great joys of being a pupil, or indeed a member of staff, is the vibrant cultural mix.
But it's in the DNA. It's in the DNA of the school. It's there from the beginning.
And that's great to hear that, as you say, it was then just as it is now.
Yes.
Yeah. That's brilliant. Somebody does ask Miss Hobson whether you've locked the Great Grammarian in the sky in the MHSG archive.
He's sitting behind me.
Somebody asks whether you can tell us anything of the personal history of Miss Cottrell, who was head in the 1970s.
Miss Cottrell, well, she came to us. She'd been headmistress at Ackworth School
in Yorkshire,
and also then at Carlisle High School for Girls. Ooh, what else?
And then before coming to us,
Yeah.
and I think she was quite a remarkable character.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she, somebody once described, she taught classics, that she build, didn't they build Pompeii in one of the classrooms?
She certainly brought it to life.
She certainly brought it to life.
Yeah.
And we don't know much more. I mean, that would be worth. I mean, we did some research when we were preparing the Headmistresses exhibition, but we need to do a little bit more research on that one.
Yeah,
that's great. So, has anything surprised you?
Anything surprised us? Well, I think
yes.
Before we started working in the archive, we hadn't really fully grasped just how few opportunities there were for women in 1874, and even at the beginning of the 20th century, and how much progress has been made. What really brought it home to us was a report that we read in the school magazine of 1905. Caroline Quenu, the biology mistress, describes in how 6 members of the Manchester High staff, including Miss Burstall, the headmistress, became Steamboat Ladies.
So amazing as it may seem to us today,
yeah,
women were barred from formal university degree status at Oxford until 1920, Cambridge until 1948, even though they passed their examinations. Sara Burstall and Caroline Quenu had both studied at Cambridge, but although they passed their finals, they weren't allowed to graduate.
But there was a curious loophole from 1904 to 1907, which meant that Oxbridge women graduates could be granted degrees from Trinity College, Dublin. So by using the fast mail boats, the expedition to Dublin could be done in 34 hours, hence the name Steamboat Ladies. And so groups of friends from the same graduation year or from the same school would often travel together. And so on April the 29th, 1905, Miss Burstall with Caroline Quenu and 4 other members of staff all set sail for Dublin and went to Trinity and were awarded their degrees. And that's why we have a graduation photo of Sara Burstall in cap and gown, taken on that occasion.
But she's not wearing a Cambridge gown. She's wearing
it really brings it home to you how lucky we are today. And also we have to remember that women weren't allowed to enter the professions until 1919. So Christabel Pankhurst, although she was the first woman to graduate in law from Manchester with a first, was rejected by Lincoln's Inn to train as a barrister because she was a woman.
We recently, to celebrate 1919 women entering the professions, we prepared an exhibition on 100 years of Manchester High lawyers. And what we realised in preparing this exhibition was that you can trace the progress of women's employment rights through them. So Christabel Pankhurst was not allowed to practice as a barrister, train as a barrister. We then had the first woman solicitor, is an old girl of Manchester High.
The first woman solicitor in England is an old girl.
The first woman to be called to the bar at Gray's Inn. And then through sort of moving forward, you see the struggle to get maternity leave, and then the struggle to sort of have a job share or to go to part-time work after having a family. And so you realise that we actually come an enormously long way.
Yes.
And the things that we take for granted have had to be fought for.
Yeah. And we were also surprised at how innovative the curriculum was at Manchester High. At the beginning, girls were taught science seriously. In the early days, girls were taught botany because it was safe. But Manchester High taught chemistry and physics in laboratories with experiments. And we actually feature in a book about early chemistry teaching in girls' schools.
And we also had PE at a time when physical exercise for girls was frowned upon. And we have some wonderful pictures of girls doing gymnastics in heavy serge tunics with stout leather belts. You don't know how they managed to move.
Yes. And also in the early days, we had secretarial and housewifery courses for girls who didn't want to go to university, or more to the point, they couldn't go. And that might seem a backward step now in 2021, but you have to see it in the context of the time when there weren't many employment opportunities for women, and the secretarial course wasn't easy. It included modern language courses in commercial French, German, Spanish, even Russian and Portuguese, as well as shorthand and typing. So the girls were very much in demand in the First World War, and they were seconded to banks and offices to help out.
And the housewifery curriculum was also very demanding, and it prepared girls for external examinations. It was seen as a science, which needed intellect to enlighten it. And what amuses us now is it was also felt it could be useful for girls who might well have a servant or a large staff of servants to control. We keep thinking, if only.
But basically, you know, how little has changed. It's the perennial problems. It's maintaining pupil numbers, the recruitment of good staff, the need for appeals to support fee income, and to allow access for bright girls who couldn't afford to come otherwise. So, you know, very little has changed.
It must all sound very familiar.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Amazing. So what records about the present day, it's possibly quite an obvious question, an obvious answer really, but what records of the present day do you think will be interesting to future generations?
Well, the answer to that is we don't know. You don't know what you're going to need in the future, what will be of interest in 100 years' time. So we just collect as much as we can now so that we can document what's happening. Obviously, in this last year, we've had to document what's the school's response to the coronavirus pandemic. That, you know, that there will be a PhD in that one day. And it's been remarkable. You know, we stand on the sidelines and we just fall back in amazement. It has been,
we are in awe.
We are in awe. It has been wonderful. Yeah.
And we've seen girls produce. It was lovely to be with you a few weeks ago when we were rewarding girls for things that they were putting in the archive.
Yes, that's right. We have a memory box. We have a memory box.
Yeah.
Some of them made. It's lovely. Yes.
Yeah. Gosh, we're living through history that are going to be
through history.
Important. Yeah. So, can you tell us about some notable pupils from your perspective?
Right. Well, we can't mention them all. We would be here all night. But,
and then some.
And then some. So we thought we might mention, in terms of notable pupils, one story, the story of a girl called Christina Ratcliffe, who was awarded the British Empire Medal for entertaining the troops in Malta during the Second World War. She was an RAF plotter and in fighter control, and later captain of her watch.
And she fell in love with an ace RAF fighter pilot who was shot down and presumed dead in 1944, but she never found out what happened to him.
No, so it's a sad story, but she's very famous in Malta, so much so that a musical play was written about her life on the island, and she's also the subject of a documentary and a biography.
The play, The Star of Straight Street, was a huge success in Malta when Valletta was European capital of culture. And there were 2 performances in London. So we decided to go and see it because we'd supplied information about Christina to the playwright and also to her biographer. And we are proud to report that in the middle of the play, Manchester High gets a mention in the script.
Yes, it was lovely. It was really lovely. But yes, recently we've had inquiries about Nesta Perry, who was the first woman police surgeon, Carrie Morrison, the first female solicitor, Catherine Corbett was one of the first 2 women medical students at Manchester. She served as a doctor in Serbia during World War I, and we have a copy of her diary in Serbia in the archive. But we could go on all night.
That's just
we have ideas of how we can get the information out there. That would be the subject of another film, possibly, or an exhibition. Yeah.
And what about notable staff?
Well, there are also many notable staff, but we can't talk about those who might still be alive. I think the person we should mention is Gertrude Powick.
Yes. Yeah, she's close to our hearts because she was a teacher of French and German at Manchester High during World War I. But she was then given leave of absence and she went to serve in northern France during helping Verdun refugees. And she wrote lots of letters back to school describing her experiences. And in 1919, after the war, she was sent to help victims of a typhoid epidemic in Poland. And sadly, she died of typhoid herself in December 1919.
And she's buried in Warsaw.
Yeah, she's commemorated on the Heaton Chapel War Memorial. And recently we went to the unveiling of a blue plaque on her family house in Hatherlow near Romilly.
Catherine Chisholm was the second of the first two women to graduate in medicine from Manchester. She became the first school doctor, in itself an innovation.
Yeah.
And she was one of the founders of the Manchester Babies Hospital.
Yeah. You have to remember that in the early days, when the pool of teaching staff, and particularly head teachers, was very small, Manchester High was a training ground for school leaders, both at home and abroad. So we've been working with a researcher in Australia who was interested in Marion Clark, who taught at Manchester High. And then she went and founded a school in Sydney, which is still in existence.
And then there are a couple of other members of staff who went to be headmistresses in South Africa, in Pretoria and Bloemfontein.
Yeah. So those are just a few.
Yeah, but we could go on.
We could go on.
Manchester High spreads wide, it's brilliant. On the chat, somebody's asked if there are any published books about Manchester High or about the archive, or is there one going to happen?
Well, who knows? I mean, we have got the 150th anniversary coming up. There are published books. I mean, Sara Burstall wrote about the history of the school. So did Dr. Clark. Mary Clark did. Yep. Books were produced for the centenary, for the 125th anniversary. They were in-house publications. So there are publications that we have in the archive, yes, that they are out of print now. Although actually you can get Sara Burstall's books still on Amazon.
Second-hand.
So you can get second-hand copies. They are still in existence,
and
they are absolutely fascinating. Yes, I think it's something that we need to think about. Yes.
It's another project for you, perhaps.
Another project.
Somebody asks whether the introduction of direct grant places and county council scholarships increased diversities from the 1950s. Now, I wonder if you've got a view on that.
I think that would have to be we'd have to research.
I think I don't think we can give a definitive answer on that. I think we would need to do a bit more research. I don't want to talk too much off the top of our heads on that. We would need to research that.
And because
it's a good question.
It's a very good question, and we have been thinking about the sort of the evolution from straightforward fee paying to direct grant. We have been doing quite a lot of thinking about that. Of course, some of that information would be confidential.
Yeah,
because it's,
I mean, certainly, as teaching staff, we aren't aware of who receives bursaries, etc. So it's not always easy to get that information, to be perfectly honest, from the archive.
But I think it's a good question.
But it's a good question,
and it's one that I think would require quite a lot of detailed research.
Yeah,
but worth doing.
Yeah, there's a lot of fascinating questions that I'm sure you'll be interested in looking at, and certainly lots of individual memories too, which I think will be brilliant for you to look at.
Yes.
There's another question, a really interesting question now about how things have changed so much and what gets included in the archive. What about emails? Because obviously we don't send handwritten letters anymore.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the question of electronic records it's a question which really exercises archivists. It's things like capturing social media posts, for example, Flickr feeds. Everything is so ephemeral, and we try to capture as much as possible, but there is just too much almost.
And the other thing is the paper endures, but platforms, electronic platforms, come and go. So our present archive website, which is brilliant, is obsolete because the platform on which it operates is no longer supported. And so amongst school archivists, and there is a group of school archivists, they are constantly talking about capturing born digital media. How do you store it? How do you ensure that it can still be viewed in 100 years' time? We can go back to the copperplate records written lovingly by the governor's clerks,
and we can have them digitized. And one thing that we should mention is that we are about to launch a new website, and for that we have started. We've had some of our records, school magazines to start with, and school reports, early ones. We've had those professionally scanned, and the documents are then searchable. So they're really good for researchers. So you'll be able to consult those. We'll be sending out details about how to access the new website shortly. And so we will have the physical records, and we will have electronic records as well.
But
it's a good question.
It's a very good question, and it's one that troubles
everybody.
Yeah. In fact, there are questions that we've got about when we're going to digitize the archive. So that's great to hear that people will be able to access it. We've also had some questions about the musical life of the school.
Oh yes,
Right. Well, we know a certain amount about the sort of musical curriculum. So we know that harmony was taught from 1874, right from the beginning, and the girls had singing lessons, and they had a piano teacher. In 1886, Forsyth brothers began to take charge of piano tuning here, and violin teaching seems to have started around 1898, and the first school concert
seems quite late. 1900, that seems quite late. But we have had some very distinguished musicians amongst the staff and the girls. Isabel Bailey, the opera singer, was a pupil at Manchester High. Annie Warburton, we have to mention Annie Warburton. She was head of music from 1925 to 1957. And the textbooks that she wrote on music and music education are still in use today. And of course, the Warburton Trophy is named after her and presented annually at what was Speech Night, now the Celebration and Awards evening.
And the present music house was opened in 1984 by Ida Carroll, who was a former pupil, and she later became principal of the Northern School of Music. So I think music is a tradition.
Yeah, sadly, we've also just heard of the death of Sheila Nelson, who was a head girl. She was head girl when the Mitzi Cunliffe sculpture was unveiled, and she became a very pioneering violin teacher, and pioneered her own method of teaching violin. So she is very, very well known in musical circles. She was one of ours.
Lovely, amazing. So how can, from your point of view now, how can old girls help you?
Well, just please keep in touch with the development department and the archive. Do contact us directly, and please let us know what Katie did next. We just need to know what happened to everyone. What is really hard for us is, of course, that girls very often change their names, and so it's really quite hard sometimes to keep track of people. So please keep in touch with us.
And if you are clearing out, decluttering, let us know if you come across any memorabilia or documents or photos that you don't want anymore or would be prepared to scan. We will treasure them. And, in 100 years' time, somebody will be thrilled to discover them. They will be of use. Throw nothing away.
That's brilliant. There's just a few more questions coming in, if it's okay, just to carry on asking you a few questions. Lots of girls kind of having really lovely memories of you as teachers too, which is great. And
Spicy still recognise us.
Not so old.
Oh, don't think so. So Alice says, I'm interested to know when language exchanges with other schools first started, and if there are any former pupils of interest in the archives who are international students. That's a tricky question.
That would take some research.
What we do know is that girls were still travelling abroad.
They were still travelling to Germany in 1939.
Trips were taking place.
And actually, even before that, if you go back and look in the old school magazines, they were quite intrepid.
They were.
weren't they were going on trips abroad, and you think, I'm not so sure about that. It's they were intrepid. There was a fantastic expedition to Norway, wasn't there, which was for the centenary, and amazing what they drove themselves.
Yeah,
scientific research.
That is a question which we will do the research, and if whoever asked the question gets in touch with us, we can then send an answer.
But it also would be quite an interesting, quite an interesting exhibition, or maybe even a film.
Yes, who knows?
You're not going to be able to stop all these films. What about the uniform? Does the archive include a uniform over the years?
Yes, we do have uniform samples of uniform, kindly donated by OGOs throughout the decades. And one of our we've just started a project on uniform. We're hoping to create a uniform timeline. So if anyone has a picture of themselves in uniform, day one,
with the blazer that's bought for
proud
gross.
parents taking the photograph of the daughter in uniform. If we could have those photos dated, that would be so helpful. We've already had quite a few, and thank you very, very much to those of you.
They're absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
They're so useful, because you can, what we're trying to do is to have a sort of a photographic timeline, so that you can see how.
But basically, it was the sports kit which started uniform.
Yeah.
And that's quite common in
and then
girls' schools.
and then later the gym slips were used, were worn all the time. But yes, so any photos would be most gratefully received.
And we would hope then to be able to, and the aim is that would go on the website then, that we would have that, you would be able to sort of have a timeline.
Yes,
we thought would be quite fun.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, lots of people saying, I've got this, and I'll send it in, which is brilliant. And one person has said, and I know that we've spoken about this together, are there any gaps in the archive that we could help you to fill? Between myself, my mother, who left in 1955, and her memories from my grandmother, who went to Dover Street, we may be able to help.
Yes.
So where
we love dynasties.
We love dynasties.
We love dynasties.
I mean, we have got another plan in mind, and lockdown has delayed a lot of things. We would love to talk to dynasties of Manchester High pupils. The lost decades of the 70s and the 80s is quite extraordinary, isn't it? And we aren't the only people who have these gaps. But when we've talked to archivists, for example, at Oxbridge colleges, and for some reason, the 70s
it's the 70s are just
very empty. We don't know why. We don't have the photographic records. One problem, of course, is that in the early days of colour photography, the quality was so poor that photographs that were taken then have turned into some sort of muddy brown, nasty, not even, distinguished sepia, but just horrible muddy brown and orange. And so photos of the 70s and 80s would be wonderful.
Yeah, and the late 60s
Dover
as well.
Street and as we said before, prep. We do have gaps in the archive for prep. So anything you can tell us, reminiscences of prep, life in prep, that would be wonderful. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you. So on that point, how do people get in touch with you if they want to do some research in the archive?
Well,
I mean, you can email us, and development will, you can either contact us via development. There are sorts of portals,
or directly. I think development will send out our contact details.
Once the pandemic is over, normal life resumes, then we can arrange visits if you want to come and do research using the physical records. We can't give free access to the archive source because there's a lot of confidential information that we hold. But what we do normally do is then we extract the information that a researcher would want to look at. And as long as we are not breaking or contravening any GDPR principles, we're happy to do that. For people who are further away, can't get to us, if they just give us
Just
sort of a rough idea of
yes,
their
if
research
you
area.
send us the details of your area of research, and we can then look to see what sort of things we have. We can let you know what we have,
We can scan.
and then we can scan and send documents to you. So long as we're not contravening GDPR or copyright legislation, we are more than happy to do that. That's what we do. That's what we do.
Fantastic. I'm just going to ask a couple more before we go. Does MHSG have a girl guide company?
Yes, yes, it did.
And we discovered its flag only recently.
We have its banner in the archive. We have its banner. We have lots of photos. We have records of the girls who were in the guides.
We have some fabulous photographs which were sent by from New Zealand.
Yeah.
Of ladies, the mother at guide camp, getting up to all sorts of mischief, and she describes them being driven onto their sort of where they were going to pitch their camp, sort of spread-eagled across bales of straw on the tracks. I'm thinking
health and safety implications just make our blood run cold. But yes, we did have a guide through. Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. A lovely question from Sophie here. Given what you've found through your fantastic work in the archives, what do you think are the key events or milestones in the school's history that have most influenced the character and ethos of the school today? That's a fabulous question.
It's a fabulous question. It is a fabulous question. Well, I think the wars, obviously, clearly, because that had an impact on everyone. It had to. And when we've only given you a sort of glimpse, but when you read the stuff in the magazines, they were very stoic, very determined, and I think the sort of the can-do attitude that you associate with Manchester High really shines through. I think, I know it's not history, but I think you have to mention the coronavirus pandemic. And we have looked back in the records to see what has happened. We've lived through other pandemics. We've lived through measles and mumps and scarlet fever and the Spanish flu. The school has never had to close for any length of time. This is going to be a period which has marked the school. There's no doubt about that. And it's the present now, but it will be history, and it will have marked the school. Yes, of course. And
as Pamela said before, standing on the sidelines as ex-members of staff, we are simply in awe of
the way staff and girls have coped with what has been a huge transformation in teaching and learning. So hats off.
And still not lost a day. Teaching, which is
absolutely
something that we're really proud of.
Yeah.
We were there when you closed on the Friday, and Monday off they went with remote teaching.
Marvelous.
Respect.
Brilliant. Another one here. Is the late book in the archives? It would be interesting to see whether the excuses have changed over the years.
We've got a wonderful picture in Dover Street of the late book.
Yes.
Being signed. And we would need to look for that. I don't know.
I can't remember. We have so much that we can't remember absolutely everything. But again, if the person who asked the question gets in touch with us, we will endeavour to find out, and we will let you know.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. There are lots of suggestions that you should do your own podcast. So, as expected, you've been brilliant tonight. Thank you so much, Pam and Gwen, for a fascinating evening. And I'm sure, like everyone, that we could just carry on going on all evening to hear more stories. And I know that you feel a real sense of pride at still being a part of what I know is a remarkable school. But thank you so much for the work that you do in keeping the archive very much a living part of Manchester High. So thank you for everything that you do. Keep going. And we would like to do this event again because it's been fascinating. So thank you. And thank you to everyone with being with us this evening. Thank you for all of your suggestions and your comments. Please get in touch with us. and give us your memories, because you can see how much Gwen and Pam want them as part of the archive. So thank you for being with us all this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.